Hi, I'm Carol Anne Riddell, and welcome to Book It with CA. We've all got a story to tell, and this month we are talking with three authors who've done just that in deeply personal memoirs. Joining us, Diane Cardwell, author of Rockaway, Susan Burton, whose book is Empty, and Carder Stout, the author of Lost in Ghost Town.
Diane, Susan, Carter, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm so glad to see all of you.
Really nice to be here.
I first want to say how much I enjoyed your books and how I appreciated how candid all of you are. You know, and it's funny because since they're memoirs, I feel sort of like I know each of you a little bit. So now it's a real treat to be able to talk to you. So I appreciate that. I'd like to start by having each of you describe the journey that you take us through in your books. And I know that's asking you to do a lot very quickly, but let's try it anyway. Susan, why don't we start with you and Empty?
Sure. Empty tells the story of the eating disorders that I kept secret for decades, essentially until I started writing this book. During my adolescence, I toggled between anorexia and binge eating. And then for decades, sort of existed within anorexia in a way that I didn't completely understand. I didn't define it for myself as an eating disorder. I sort of thought I had left those things behind in my adolescence. I realized I was preoccupied with food, but I didn't consider myself somebody who still had an illness. But in engaging with this material, once I sat down to write the book, I realized that I was really still struggling. So the book itself covers me from ages 10 to 24, but it's told from, the perspective of the woman I was in my 40s, sorting through this past.
Right, so we kind of go with you through that process.
Exactly.
So Carter, let's talk about Lost in Ghost Town. Tell us what Lost in Ghost Town is, what Ghost Town is.
Ghost Town is a neighborhood in Venice Beach, California, and it is a neighborhood that I write about in the book, and the present tense of the story is in about 2003. And at that time, it was really the epicenter of the drug activity on the west side of Los Angeles. And it was inhabited by a gang called the Shoreline Crips. And the story that I write in my memoir really talks about my involvement with this group. And I came from a fairly prominent family in Washington, D.C., and lost everything and ended up driving for one of the gang members. So it's really the story of a friendship, an unlikely friendship that evolves between myself and a man named Flynn, who had grown up in Venice and was involved in the gangs.
Mm-hmm. And you also, in your memoir, you go between your life as a child and then your adult life at that point.
I do. So the present tense of the story is 2003 in Ghost Town. And every alternate chapter takes a look at my childhood or my adolescence or my teen years and sort of tells the story of how I got there.
Right. So Diane, tell us a little bit about Rockaway.
So I was just thinking as Carter was talking, my memoir also jumps around a bit. It essentially is the story of, how I, after a divorce and sort of feeling like my life had fallen apart, how I built, kind of changed my life, transformed to something much more focused on happiness than, the kind of achievement-oriented life that I'd been living up until then. And I made that transformation through the very, very unlikely pursuit of surfing. It's something I grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, kind of not very athletic, total urban creature, and just stumbled upon surfing in middle age and thought, and when I saw it, I had grown up thinking, oh, surfing, that's something that crazy people do, right? Because you have to be insane to want to ride those huge waves that they showed on Wide World of Sports. And
I think that too when I see it.
Right. But then I was working at the New York Times. I stumbled upon surfing in Montauk, and there were these just what looked like beautiful, graceful, mythical creatures, riding very mellow waves. And I thought, maybe I could do that. And so the actual narrative of the book is from that moment to all of the places that my pursuit of surfing in the face of really being terrible at it took me, which was landing me in Rockaway Beach in a weird little old bungalow that was originally built as a summer cottage, and making friends, coming out of my shell, finding love and happiness, and surviving Superstorm Sandy. So,
and you're still there now, as you said.
And I'm still there right now as we speak.
I want to ask each of you a follow-up question just so that we can get into some more detail. I mean, all of it is so fascinating, but Susan, let me start with you. I was so struck in the book by what a controlling force food became for you. In some ways, not unlike some of the addiction that Carder described actually in his book. You talk about this sort of constant dialogue you have with yourself, this it's all or it's nothing, particularly in terms of the binge eating. Can you walk us through what one of those episodes felt like?
When I describe a binge, I always like to start with the events that precede and follow a binge, because an eating disorder is about so much more than just food. It's about using food to cope with uncomfortable feelings, to cope with emotional pain. So, here's a typical example. My senior year of high school, I'm leaving a concert with my best friend, Jules. And Jules, it was like one of those intense friendships where she just meant the world to me. And I always felt that I wanted more from her than she wanted from me. And I often left interactions with her just feeling really just deflated. And this was the case that night. I dropped her off at her house after the concert, started driving to my house. And the whole while I was saying to myself, I'm going to go inside, hang my key, and go straight upstairs. Go inside, hang my key, go straight upstairs. Meaning that I wasn't going to go into the kitchen. I wasn't going to binge. So I pulled into my driveway, I went inside, I hung my key, and then I went into the kitchen. And, I was just going to have one bite. I was just going to have one bite of chicken. It had been an all-day concert. I hadn't eaten much that day, which, is part of the binge cycle, the restriction binge cycle. And I never just had one bite. I opened the freezer, I took out a pint of ice cream, ate to the bottom, returned to the freezer, took out, frozen muffin. It was the late 80s in Boulder, Colorado, and there were these oat bran muffins that my mother bought, and they weren't good frozen. They stuck in your chest. It was just shoving food in. And while I was doing it, I didn't have to think. There was nothing but this. As long as I was putting another bite of food in my mouth, I didn't have to think about any loss or pain or discontent. And as soon as I was done, I did feel a lot. I felt physical discomfort. I hated myself. But again, those feelings were familiar. They were all part of a cycle. I still wasn't dealing with, whatever hurt had been caused by whatever interaction I did or did not have with my friend.
Carder, does some of that sound, what Susan describes feeling in those moments, sound familiar to you?
Absolutely, it sounds very familiar. In the book, I talk about, in one of the chapters, which is a flashback chapter to my childhood, actually struggling with eating disorders myself.
Yes.
As a 11, 12-year-old boy growing up in DC, and my parents were going through a very nasty divorce, and I really didn't know what to do with all of the feelings that I was having. And so I think of eating disorders as really my first addiction. And I think of, because
so interesting. That's very
the way I look at addiction and consider addiction is it's really an obsessive and compulsive disorder. So you have obsessive thoughts that are followed by a compulsive action. And of course, that transformed into alcohol later on in my life, and then to cocaine, which was really very present in my life in Ghost Town when I tell the story. But certainly it's to think back on those days and think about how influenced I was And I really didn't have the ability, I didn't know how to stop once this cycle had really consumed me. And of course I did want to stop, and I wanted to get my life back on track, but it was an overwhelming feeling. And I was struggling with a lot of emotional trauma that I had not processed and had not excavated, because I didn't know how to do that either. And I think that for many years I was holding on to a lot of that pain and was self-medicating as a way to soothe myself.
Diane, as you said earlier, like surfing was definitely outside of your comfort zone physically, but also I took from the book emotionally, because you were emerging from this divorce. As you said, you felt like your life had sort of fallen apart, and you describe yourself as someone who was shy, hesitant about new situations. So I wonder how surfing kind of addressed that piece of it, the emotional piece of it.
Right. Well, first, I do want to say that one of the things when I was listening to Susan and Carter talk about addiction, and some of the language is actually similar to how surfing was for me, but it just led to a healthier place, right? But talking about, the thing that was so amazing, and this actually does get to the answer to your question. When you're in the water, it's like it demands total presence in a way that almost nothing else does. And so no matter what's going on in your life, no matter, whether you're miserable, whether you're happy, whatever it is, when you're out there in the water, it's just you and the ocean and a surfboard. And maybe there are other surfers there, but it demands a kind of attention and obsessiveness, because you have to wrap your life around it if you're going to get out there and catch, right? You got to go when there are waves, not when you feel like it necessarily. So all of that actually just made me a little more conscious of what I was feeling, how I was being in the world, how I was relating to other people, and also being in the water. You by necessity already have something in common with anyone else who's out there. And so that just makes it easier to strike up a conversation, to
make that connection.
And so I found that all of it led me to be much more open in the world, and kind of conscious and sensitive to my surroundings, to the rhythms of, weather and the earth and all of that. It just becomes like almost mystical kind of consciousness that I ended up being able to carry into everyday relationships out of the water as well.
Would you say in retrospect that it sort of helped you heal from the trauma of the divorce?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I had started on that path. I had, sort of begun piecing myself back together, but I hadn't quite figured out how I was going to live. We were married for 5 years, but we were together for 10 before that. It's like my whole life seemed wrapped up in this marriage and, our jobs and our beautiful townhouse in Brooklyn. And, all of that kind of went away. And I was like, okay, so what actually does make me happy?
Right.
And I found that not just surfing, but also just being in Rockaway made me feel better than any place else that I was in the city. And so I thought, universe is trying to tell you something. You need to be here.
Obviously your books are vastly different, and they're all telling these individual stories, but there were some common threads that I found really interesting. I mean, all of you were clearly overcoming something to varying degrees, but also, all of you talk about your childhoods, your relationships with your parents. And that is not to say that I felt that any of you were sort of assigning blame, because that's not what I took away from your books at all. But I did take away that the context of family is very important as you sort of examine your life looking back. So I would love to talk about that a little bit. And Carter, maybe we could start with you on this. You said in the book, how it was so hard to live up to your father's expectations. And there was this sense that, that it was never quite enough. There was also this sort of pervasive loneliness I took away in terms of your connection to your parents, or what was a lack of connection.
Absolutely true. Very much so. My father was this heroic figure in my life until a certain age. And I just really wanted his attention and his love. And he was very busy. He was off. He was a businessman in Washington, D.C. He was traveling a lot. And when he did come home, he had, it didn't seem as though he was very interested in building our relationship. And so it really made me feel as though I was unwanted in a way. My mother was a socialite who also was an alcoholic. And so she really wasn't there emotionally for me in the way that I needed her to be, and I wanted to. And I had an older brother named Craig, who really became this really important figure in my life because he took care of me and he really raised me. From the outside looking in, you would think that we had a wonderful, perfect family. But on the inside, you never know what's going on behind closed doors.
Susan, I imagine some of that sounds familiar to you in the sense that your parents also divorced when you were, I think it was 13, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
And would you say that impacted where you ended up?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I would have been able to connect A to B at the time. The divorce definitely divided my life into a before and after at that stage. I think that I was definitely using food to cope with a lot of the anger I had trouble expressing, with the loss I felt. I mean, it's really, when I think back on that history, it's really significant to me that there was a stage when I was 16 where I was sort of on the tail end of anorexia, and I was about to tip over into binge eating, which is a really typical trajectory, though I didn't know that at the time. And my father, who lived in Michigan, came out to visit me and my sister for a long weekend in Colorado where we lived. It was Columbus Day weekend. And I was always nervous when my father came to visit because I loved him, because it was so fraught. And I was also nervous because we always ate in restaurants. And I went out to lunch with my father and I ate, a lot of food I didn't necessarily even like. And then I came home, he dropped me off, and I went into my kitchen and I wasn't hungry, but I went to the cupboard, I opened the cupboard, and I dug my hand into this little bag of chocolate trail mix we had. It was another food I'd never liked. It had kind of like these limp coconut chips and like these bird seeds. And, but I just ate it. And the feeling I had when I ate that was the feeling that would characterize all the years to come, which was want something else, want more, something more. And, what did I want in that moment? Like, did I want, was it a taste thing? Did I just want other food because the food I hadn't eaten, didn't satisfy me? Did I want something from my father that I wasn't getting from him? Did I want to show him some part of myself that I felt unable to convey? Probably a mix of all those things.
Diane, one of the things that struck me also in your book, and this is again a similar thread, is that you talk about your father and you say that achievement was, quote unquote, the reigning narrative in the house. And I thought that was a really interesting way to describe it. How did that impact you?
Well, I, like Carter in some ways, right, felt that I had a lot to live up to and I couldn't quite ever get there, especially with my father. I come from 4 generations of college graduates, right? My father used to tell me this, and one of whom was born a slave and became a university professor. So it's like, how am I going to top that one? Right? So it's just right. I mean, so the narrative of achievement was very strong, and it was also partly being Black. It was how my parents felt we would be able to kind of deal with racial discrimination, right? You have to be better than. And so it was almost like a kind of perfection that I was striving for and never able to get there. And my dad was definitely kind of a taskmaster. I have a scene in the book that I talk about where I brought home, a 97 on a math test, and I'm showing it to him and he's like, 97? How come it isn't 100? And it's, he's smiling, but he's not really joking.
Not really
And I knew that, right? Like the smile isn't quite getting to the eyes.
Yeah.
So and also my father was, charming and wonderful, but also an alcoholic and could be very sort of mean and angry and volatile. And so I just had this sense that if I didn't achieve, I was never going to have any kind of peace in that house. I ended up afraid to fail, right? Anything that I wasn't good at, didn't show an aptitude for, I just dropped it because the price of failure was so high in my house that I just couldn't tolerate it. And so here comes surfing, and I suck. And I mean, there's no two ways. I had to really, really work and sort of kind of talk to myself constantly about, where these feelings were coming from, and didn't I want to get away from them, and didn't I want to stop letting those things hold me back as I had let them so many times before. And so that's part of the story of the book, is really coming to terms with trying to pursue something that you just love to do, even though you're not very good.
I really love to understand the process of writing, and I'm particularly fascinated by memoirs because, unlike fiction or nonfiction, the stories are so deeply personal. So I want to ask each one of you what it was like to share your story, and did you have misgivings about doing so?
Well, I found it terrifying, but also, really gratifying, right? But I was mostly afraid of inadvertently, telling someone else's story that they might not want told in the telling of mine. And also, especially the childhood stuff, I was like, I want to make sure that I am only bearing my soul and not anybody else's. Yeah. So I actually ended up engaging a lot of the people in the book. Even though my editor was sort of leery of this, I ended up sharing pages with pretty much everybody who's named in it. I actually have a decent relationship with my ex-husband. I wanted to preserve that. I'm close with my sister. I wanted to preserve that. I live in Rockaway. I didn't want everyone, to be driving me out of here with pitchforks. So I did want to have some buy-in from people and make sure that there weren't details that they were uncomfortable making public.
Diane, so much of what you said is to the letter of my experience. Foremost, like among the difficult parts, were wondering about, especially my parents, and the impact that this book would have on them, because I do expose them. I did write about things that I'm sure they would have rather kept private, things that did cause them pain to read. I shared pages with them beforehand. And like you, I shared pages with essentially everybody I named in the book. And I spent years really paralyzed, not ready to write that book about my eating disorders. And once I finally was ready to do it, the whole thing became so much easier. I was finally telling the story I needed to tell.
I had always wanted to tell my story. It took me a while. It was about 17 years after it happened. And there was a moment that I had while I was writing where one day I just woke up with a lot of fear about the fact that I was really pulling the covers off of my life, right, and telling incredibly personal things. I sat with myself and I talked myself through it and remembered that I'm really proud of the story. And so that I am happy that it is my legacy, and hoping that it does provide some comfort for people that are going through similar things. Both of my parents had passed away. I tried to be as authentic as I possibly could, but I guess the concern wasn't that they were going to read it and they were going to be upset.
Right. It's just freeing, I suppose, in some way as well.
Right. And my brother, he was a heroic figure in this story. And some of the early childhood chapters that I wrote about him were really personal and really meaningful to me. And unfortunately, he was dying from cancer when I had completed about half the book. And so the last thing that I got to give to him was the first half of the manuscript, and I had dedicated the book to him. And it was a very emotional moment, and he got to read those chapters, and they were, they really touched him very deeply. And so
what a gift. What a gift.
When I think of that, it makes me really happy that I was able to give that to him before he transitioned to the other side.
Thank you for sharing that. This has been so wonderful for me. I was so struck by how authentic and candid all of you have been. Thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Carol Anne.
Thank you. It's been great.
Thank you so much.
I hope you found that conversation as fascinating as I did. That wraps up another chapter of Book It with CA, but we will be back again soon. In the meantime, please follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Suggestions are always welcome, and we'd love to know what you're reading. You can also find this episode and more details on our website. I'm Carol Anne Riddell. Thanks so much for watching, and see you next time.